Well, that is a tough act to follow for sure, but we won't even try. Well, welcome everyone. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks to Linda Adams for the invitation. It's an honor to be up here with the Gang of Four. We have a lot of broad policy experience up here today, and we're going to use energy, food, and water as sort of a broad construct to talk about a bunch of different policy areas. The title of this session is California as a Beacon. So we want to get to some of the leadership areas where California is a bright beacon and some areas where perhaps it could be a little brighter. Should also mention that we'll be recording this for a Climate One podcast that will be available on Capitol Public Radio starting in a few days. I think you know who most of these people are. John Laird, Secretary of California Natural Resources Agency. Karen Ross, Secretary of Department of Food and Agriculture. Matt Rodriquez, Secretary of California EPA. And President Peevey of the California Public Utilities Commission. I'm Greg Dalton. So let's begin with addressing the key issue of California as a beacon. Where is it a beacon showing leadership? And also we want to get to areas where perhaps California could shine a little brighter. So Secretary Laird, where is California leading brightly right now?
Well, thanks, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. Thanks for putting us after Joel instead of in front of him, because I think we would have been lampooned if it had been in reverse.
Yes.
And just for the record, when I was in the legislature, I was very offended by the fact that we were going to change the name to the Natural Resources Agency, and I didn't think it was appropriate for the agency to be the NRA. And so I voted against it, and now I'm the secretary of the NRA. So it's a good thing. I think just within the sphere of the Resources Agency, there's two places where we're really a beacon. One is in energy, energy standards, efficiency and conservation and consumption of energy. California, on a per capita basis, has been a leader for decades in many ways as a tribute to the first run of Governor Brown and things he did there. Whether if you're a consumer, it's $60 billion at least. That's an old number now that you've saved, but you look at what it takes to generate that energy and the renewable that comes from it having been saved. That is real leadership. And I think California has had real emerging leadership in water conservation. It's hard to believe, but the Los Angeles Basin has grown by 3 million people in the last 25 years on the same amount of water. So they basically, in the last generation, have shifted to conservation, recycling, providing their growth. And we're just in the lead in any of a number of ways there, but we still have a long ways to go.
And Secretary Ross, let's get your ideas on where California is shining brightly as a beacon.
Well, agriculture in this state is a beacon for the world. We are one of only 5 Mediterranean climates, which gives us the advantage to be able to grow the diversity of crops that we do. So instead of many of the states where if they're lucky they've got 6 or 7 commodities they can grow, we have 400. And we continue to add new crop patterns to it because of that diversity and also because of the diversity of our population. So we are growing more food than we did 20 years ago on the same amount of water and slightly less. And we are big users of energy and water, but we're producing so much food that's the harvest part of that has to be considered in this. We not only are the largest ag state and have been for 63 years because that's how long they've been measuring it. We also have the most farmers markets. We have the most organic acreage. We have the most CSAs. And we're the #1 exporter of food to all those people around the globe. And what's important about our food that we grow here is that it is so healthy and nutritious. Our mix is exactly what's on the USDA dinner plate. Fruits, vegetables, tree nuts, lean dairy and meat proteins, and whole grains, and wine.
And maybe after today...
In case you didn't enjoy enough last night.
And Pop-Tarts? No. Pop-Tarts.
That other crop.
Yeah.
I don't regulate it, and yes, we've been asked to do organic certification, but I'm not going to do that.
For another day. Secretary Rodriquez, where is California leading brightly?
Oh, let me think. One of the real pleasures of working in Cal EPA is that we are working on just so many cutting-edge issues and I hate to use a term like cutting edge, but that's just the truth, in so many different areas. Clearly of relevance to today's gathering is the work that we're doing on climate change. That's a very significant objective and priority for the governor and for previous governors as well. And so, everybody knows about our cap and trade program. And I'm reminded on a daily basis of the significance of that program by the number of inquiries and calls I get from literally all over the world. What are we doing with our program? The whole world is watching what California is doing to address climate change and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And as I tell the folks at ARB, there's no pressure. We just can't make any mistakes. We've got to make this program work. And that's really been the focus of a lot of our energy over the last several months. And I'm very excited about the program and the people that we've got working on the program. You pair that with all the other work that we're doing to try and deal with reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, looking at the work that is being done by the Air Resources Board and trying to encourage and work with car manufacturers to promote cleaner cars and cleaner vehicles. Again, another initiative that California is really leading the country, if not the world, on. The governor just signed an executive order promoting zero-emission cars and their use here in California. And because California is watched by so many people, we really do set a standard and example for the rest of the world and how we should be dealing with cars. And what's critical in all of that is, particularly as you look at our work with the industry, the automobile manufacturers, is the fact that that's a real demonstration that California can accomplish its environmental objectives while working with industry. I was really struck when I went to the auto show in LA last year about how closely the auto industry was interested in working with California to make sure that these zero-emission cars really work and are accepted by the public. And so it's a good example of how you can advance your environmental objectives and work with industry and promote new jobs in the economy. And that's what we're doing in this particular segment, in energy and addressing climate change. But I will put in a plug for some of the other departments that are within the agency, because we're doing much the same thing and looking at chemicals that are being introduced into our daily lives through our safer consumer products regulations, and looking at what we can do to regulate the chemicals that are being introduced into our daily lives. And we're working very closely with Food and Ag to make sure that we have a very, very vigorous and vibrant agricultural economy. At the same time, we're looking at some options and alternatives, and I will turn off my phone, it's probably China calling about climate change again. We're working very closely with agriculture to look at non-fumigant and non-pesticide alternatives that we can use in our agricultural economy. So it's a very aggressive agenda, but we've got some wonderful folks who have committed their lives to public service, and it's just a real pleasure to be working with them.
And we'll come back to those, certainly cap and trade and the auto regulations, et cetera. President Peevey, where is California leading most brightly?
Well, I think Matt has touched on a number of them already. Frankly, AB 32, the enactment of AB 32, and the consequences of that, not only cap and trade program, but the commitment to an 80% reduction by 2050 over 1990 levels, CO2 and others, is a dramatic thing that no other state has duplicated. But it's not just there. I mean, I think across the board almost, California has done a remarkable job. In energy efficiency, we've been able to hold per capita usage at about the same level it was 30 years ago. That is a dramatic thing. No other state has done that. Probably no other nation has done that. And that's a tribute to the creation of the California Energy Commission and its building standards and its appliance standards, and of the Public Utilities Commission and all the energy efficiency programs we sponsor and promote. Over $1 billion a year is now spent. in this arena. And I might just point out at this point that the Energy Commission, you know, was implemented by Governor Brown the first time he was in office, but it was actually created by Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan is the one that signed the creation, created the California Energy Commission in 1974. And as Barack Obama has pointed out today, Ronald Reagan would have a hell of a time becoming the Republican nominee. So times have changed significantly. But I also think in areas like the California Solar Initiative, a very dramatic step. By 2017, we'll have 3,000 megawatts of solar on rooftops. I think of our emission standards regarding coal, where we basically, the Public Utilities Commission said that we won't be any more importation of coal unless the emissions can meet the combined cycle gas turbine, CCGT. And now, 6 years later, EPA, the federal EPA, has adopted that standard for the nation as a whole. That's the one that is so criticized. So people want to single out in Kentucky, California in this war on coal. I guess that you could say that some of us were the generalissimos of that effort. So there are so many areas that California's led. I know it sounds chauvinistic to say this because there's a lot more we can do and there's a lot of low-hanging fruit still to be gathered. But the state has dramatically altered perceptions, I think, not only here in California and in this country, but even internationally. I'm sure that it was unlikely that the Chinese were calling Matt at this moment, but I would say that we get tremendous amount of international attention in California from visiting groups from China, India, and elsewhere who all want to grasp what this state is doing because it is on the cutting edge.
Well, one thing that's very much at the forefront of the national energy discussion right now is hydraulic fracturing. And let's talk a little bit about natural gas, which supplies a lot of the energy in this state. It touches on certainly energy and water. Yesterday I heard Secretary Chu in New York at the New York Times say the U.S. is going to explore exporting natural gas. It's abundant, it's cheap, it's American. But Governor Brown recently said he had some concerns about fracking, its impacts on water, et cetera. So is California a leader on fracking right now?
I don't think it is right now, but I think it's about to be.
How so?
And I think that the governor is very sincere in a commitment to getting the best handle on this environmentally. I think John probably could speak to this more effectively than I can, but there is that effort nationally to wish to export gas, and in fact, a major California corporation, one of its LNG facilities in the Gulf could very well be doing that within a year.
There's not anywhere near the fracking going on in California that might be going on in other states, and the formations are very different. But at the same time, there's some bills moving through the legislature to actually determine what in fact is happening, to actually report, and it's just a question of how to report. There's a bill on each side, and right now it is regulated in California to the extent that you make sure that it is completely covered, separate from water sources, but at the same time, there's no requirement to report fully that that's what's going on. So I think that there's proposals to enhance the regulatory scheme and deal with it that are working their way through the legislature this year, and I think that'll clarify a lot more about what's going on.
Yeah, one of those bills calls for listing chemicals in the fracking fluid, which some companies are doing voluntarily. I think some states are requiring disclosing the amount of water recovered, public maps so people can see where the chemicals are, which I think this would be of interest to agriculture. Potentially, if the water system gets fouled, Karen Ross, that's not going to be good for farmers.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I haven't heard from a lot of the farm community, but I know that one of the major wine publications just did a big feature article on that and raised some of the very concerns that you just touched on, that I have complete faith in my good friend John Laird in making sure that they go forward correctly.
So do you...
And I might also add, this is the thing about farming, is that you have land mass, and oftentimes there's the exploration stage, and so there's a check that creates a revenue stream just to do the exploration before you even determine if it's possible to do any of this technology. So oftentimes farmers are in this dilemma of they have this land base and they want to maximize that asset in every way possible. So it will create some conflict in the agricultural community itself.
And just for the record, California historically has had oil or gas resources in 4 or 5 major places in the state, whether it's Long Beach, Inglewood, western or eastern Kern, southern Monterey County, off the coast in Santa Barbara. Those are the major places that it has happened, and in some of those places now, regulated with environmental review, is steam injection, just plain steam, which heats the rock, releases the oil in fields that had been drilled and mined in the past, and it's in essence a new source. Fracking is an additional step if there is actual breaking or fracturing of rock to do it. And so when you ask Karen, Kern is the one place that there's an incredible overlap with agriculture, and yet while there have been some legal notices that have been placed by the water district in the area, there's not evidence yet of an intersection, and that's why more public disclosure would be helpful, because I think it would do exactly as you said. It would point to where it is in a clear way. You'd understand whether it's intersecting. You'd understand whether it's, as it is now, it's regulated against if there's water in the vicinity already, but I think there's a public right to know that's part of it.
So you, if I understand correctly, voluntary disclosure is not enough. You think that regulation is coming and California is going to do that?
Yeah, well, I'll wait for the administration to take its formal position, but I don't think that would be a bad idea.
Okay. Secretary Peevey, any thoughts? Will you think voluntary is enough, or there ought to be more specific disclosure requirements in California about fracking fluids, location, composition?
Well, I will side with Mr. Laird's comment about we'll see what the official policy is, but I think that that's probably the desirable way to go.
Matt, you've been quiet here. Do you think the Governor Brown will come down in support of more regulation on fracking?
Well, I'll have to talk to Mr. Peevey and Mr. Laird, and then we can caucus. And
we're a very caring group.
Yeah. I will say this, that as Secretary Laird mentioned, and you mentioned, I think, that the governor is aware of the controversy concerning fracking. I mean, he's interested in making sure that we can continue to use our oil and gas resources here in the state, and I think that he's made that clear as well. But we want to be very aware of what the consequences are, and so we've been in communication with the Department of Conservation. They've got a very good new director there who's going to be looking at the fracking issue, and Mark Nekadem, and we're looking at all aspects of it. So we want to get all the information before we design a regulatory program and figure out exactly what information we need. But I've been talking to the State Water Resources Control Board about issues related to water quality. We've been talking with the Air Resources Board and other entities that are sort of watching the fracking controversy. So we'll prepare an administration position, I think, once we've got all the information that we need to make a good program.
Okay. Waste to energy is another area that connects some of your responsibilities here. Let's talk about waste to energy. Farmers that want to get connected to the grid, they think some of the utilities are making it difficult. Karen Ross?
Well, my apologies to the chairman, but this is my chance to really lobby hard for dairy digesters. We're making a lot of progress because we have almost 2 million cows in the state, and it is a renewable resource. Cows eat, it comes out. It is a huge potential renewable source of energy for us. And more importantly, unlike wind and solar, this is not intermittent. This is all around the clock. It can be stored. We can figure out how to transport it. So yes, that's been the place where we've worked across cabinet to really figure this out, how to get more dairy digesters. And in fact, it's a place where we're not the leader. We have the most cows in the state. We have less than 8 operating dairy digesters. Wisconsin has 1.2 million cows in the state. They have 24 digesters. Vermont has less than 1 million cows, and they have 12 digesters. So I think there's a real opportunity for us to seize this as part of our renewable portfolio.
John Laird, then why don't I get Mike Peevey? Yeah.
Yeah, and I always tease Karen because at least our cows are happy cows, regardless of it. This is a place where, in the question you originally asked, where's California a leader? This is one. I was a mayor in the 80s when the legislature enacted a goal of diverting 50% of what went into landfills. They said, we're going to do it in 10 years. And I remember as local elected officials, we said, that's nuts. That will never happen. That's a great goal. We will work toward it. And we are now diverting 60% out of landfills of what we put in 1989. And what it does is it frames your question. Because we've done recyclables, because we're recycling plastic and wood and many different things at levels that weren't anticipated 20 years ago, the harder nut is the last 40%. And when you add about waste to energy, then there's the question about, is that the alternative for significant amount of what is not being diverted from the landfills? And it raises all these questions because if you do it in certain ways, do you remove the incentives to recycle in the way that people have learned and changed their patterns and are recycling in significant ways? And in California, the policy question is whether you get renewable credit for doing it. And that is a real challenging issue. And so it is a place, whether there's biomass or whether there's dairy digesters or a whole host of things where California still has a long way to go. It's how does it fit in that overall continuum to make sure we're doing our best every way we can.
And just to clarify, you say California's a leader. When you talk about waste diversion, you're talking about home waste, the broad spectrum. And Karen Ross said California's not a leader, and you're talking about dairy, very specific subset of that.
I'm talking specifically dairy digesters as well as biomass conversion from agricultural growing, processing. We have a lot of trees and vines in the state that creates a biomass source. Can we collect it in a way that's efficient and doesn't create an unintended consequence in the collection and transportation of that? And also when it comes to dairy digesters, I think we've been focused on to electricity where there are opportunities as part of transportation fuels and part of the natural gas picture as well. So I just feel that in agriculture we haven't seized our byproducts from processing enough to really maximize the opportunity.
And when I met sitting in for the governor with the governors of Oregon and Washington and the premier of BC a few weeks ago, the biomass issue was at the forefront with all of them. And I think it's a place we're missing an opportunity in California. People intellectually or politically think it is the right thing to do, but it hasn't gotten the level of traction that it needs to get to actually move forward. And it fits into a number of things that are being discussed here in this conference. Because if you're talking about forests and the fact that there's all this biomass there, and in my agency, the joint department includes rangeland firefighting and the preservation of forests and energy and the Energy Commission, and they all fit together. And so if we were to really move on biomass, it is an energy source that's appropriate, while at the same time it's a fire prevention thing. And in California, one of the places that we're having trouble economically is in the most rural forested areas, and this also has the potential for being an economic boost in a place that could really use it.
Why isn't it getting more traction? Is it because the Air Resources Board has issues with digesters and particulates, because the utilities don't want competition from farmers? Why isn't there more traction on biomass?
Well, I think part of it is the silos that happen in government, and we've had a tremendous task force across cabinet, as well as bringing in our federal partners, so that everybody who touches a piece of getting it permitted or regulating it has been sitting at the table together for a year now. We've mapped it out. We figured out where some of those duplications are, where some of the conflicts are, and we already had on the books this thing called the consolidated permit process. It just hasn't been used for this type of a project, and I really commend EPA for grasping this, and we have a number of projects in the pipeline that are ready to go through this and see how we can accelerate the process and still maintain the public health and environmental goals that no one wants to give up on.
I mean,
Mike Peevey, you want to jump in? Rodriquez?
I'll say that, you know, one of the things to emphasize, one of the things that impressed me when I came into EPA is how the state is really progressing on so many different levels to deal with climate change and energy issues. So, you know, we're dealing with the question of fuels. What fuels should we be using at all? Can we move away from carbon fuels? And then you go to the next tier, which is, okay, and when we use these fuels, can we use them more efficiently? And then can we look at how we lead our lives to reduce the need for energy? You know, can we do strategic planning? Can we plan our communities in the way that we live in a way that reduces the need to use that energy? So, I mean, when you're doing all those things at all those various levels, you can't press ahead on everything at the same speed. But I will say that we've been working very collaboratively with a number of state and federal agencies to deal with dairy digester issues, to look at what we can do to promote bioenergy just generally. It requires bringing together a number of state departments and agencies. But I think you're going to see that in 3 years, one of the hallmarks of this administration is the fact that it's been able to bring the agencies and departments together to work collaboratively towards these common objectives. And I think that the effort that Secretary Ross has led in dealing with dairy digester issues is just really an excellent example of that. I mean, there are, every time I turn around, there's a new meeting on, okay, where are we with dairy digesters? And, you know, let's get everybody, moving ahead.
Can I just say, even though I'm a 4-H kid, grew up on a ranch in western Nebraska, I never thought I'd spend so much time thinking about that end of the cow.
Mike Peevey?
Well, the only thing I would add to what has been said here is that California is not a leader in waste to energy. I mean, that's just the reality. And there's no way of ducking that. I mean, you go to Germany, you go to Japan, you go to a lot of other countries, and there's a lot of waste to energy projects that go forward. They incinerate an awful lot of things. Now, there's questions in some minds about the potential health consequences of that, but they made a much greater commitment in that area than we have to date. Now, I hope that all these things that my colleagues say come to pass. But then there's the economics of this. And you asked about the utilities. They will claim that the price, in many cases, is much higher than a wind project or even some solar projects today. Yes, they are 24/7 power versus the more intermittent nature, although that's changing for solar and even for wind to some degree. And there's also some statutory limits in the state of California that were laws passed in the late 80s that are perhaps not as germane or relevant today, given what our interests are in terms of reducing greenhouse gases, than they were in the late 80s when enacted. And yet it's tough to change. We get encrusted interests sometimes that don't want to move and all that. So it's all a big ball here. The ag interests have been in to see the Public Utilities Commission repeatedly, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Forestry Service, all about as John mentions, the wood waste in our forests, and it makes no sense to leave this stuff in the form it is. I think we all agree with that, but we can't quite seem to find a perfect way to. We've done our best to keep most of the power plants that were qualifying facilities that were signed up over 20 years ago going. Not all of them. Most of them are in the San Joaquin Valley or up in the Sacramento Valley. And this is a challenge that I am not totally satisfied that California has done as great a job as it has in other areas. So I'll just let it go with that.
So perhaps in a couple of years with this conference, we'll have a different story to tell in California about some leadership on this issue.
I don't think there's any doubt about the commitment of the four of us here and the governor to wanting to do more in this regard. That's pretty clear.
So it's just a matter of sort of aligning the incentives and working with industry?
Some of it is incentives. Some of it is just getting over some of the internal hurdles, very frankly.
Let's talk about, we mentioned, get into some of the cap and trade and AB 32 issues. We mentioned forest briefly and the biomass available there. There was a lawsuit filed recently about the offsets, challenging them, which people in this audience certainly know a lot about offsets and the importance to the trading mechanism set up in California. So let's talk about that suit and what it's going to do. Who'd like to address that?
Well,
Matt Rodriquez?
Ellen Peter, the chief counsel of ARB, would probably come up and strangle me if I said too much about the details of any litigation. We'll just say that, as I understand it, the claim is that offsets were not authorized under AB 32. And so there's a challenge to the use of offsets as we incorporate them into our cap and trade program. I'll just say that we, at the state level, disagree with that and think that it's appropriate. In fact, offsets are a necessary component in any cap and trade program. So we're going to obviously oppose the lawsuit. And I think, I'll take off my attorney hat. I want to comment on the merits of the suit, but I won't do that other than to say that I wouldn't be too concerned, and we'll press ahead and keep looking at offsets. As I said, they're an important part of any cap and trade program.
Mike Peevey?
Well, I agree with Matt. I mean, not only an important part, they're an absolutely critical part. You can't have an effective cap and trade program without it. And so, I mean, I don't know the ins and outs of the lawsuit, the details of it, but you're going to find in all these precedent-setting efforts, you're going to find litigation and challenges, I think, and it's our job just to overcome them and grounded as best we are with the facts and the history, legislation, and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Offsets are often, for opponents of cap and trade, they often zero in on offsets because they think they're squishy, the additionality, they're always sort of gray and fuzzy. So if we step away from this particular suit, I mean, the concepts of offsets themselves attract a lot of critique because there's been some scams in the clean development mechanism. I mean, there's some legitimate questions about the authenticity. You know, California usually says, well, we've addressed those concerns. We've tightened all the bolts and screws here. We're not going to have the problems that have happened in other places. John Laird, do you think that's possible?
Well, I mean, we obviously don't want the problems that there are in other places, and we benefit by the fact that there are certain systems in place before we embark on the same thing. But it's exactly what Matt was saying. Whenever, and Mike chimed in, whenever you have fundamental change and you establish something strongly, everybody's going to challenge it at the beginning until it is clearly, firmly established and people can move ahead. And so I think what you're hearing is there's a commitment to do it, and we'll move ahead and just hope the chips fall in the right way.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that plaintiffs want is a standardized approach rather than a project approach to these sorts of things, so they have some kind of metrics. The clean development mechanism is criticized for being slow, expensive. It's all project by project. There's no standards, right? CARB does have some standards for livestock, urban, and other forest areas. You know, is there a technocratic solution to this?
Well, you know, Matt was very right in not going into this in detail because I would start to characterize the plaintiffs if I responded to that. Okay. And they're just going to fight it. And so we will meet them how they're fighting it, and we hope we will win.
Yeah. It is interesting that with AB 32, a lot of people expected suits from fossil fuel companies, and the suits that have actually come from the left, from enviros. This is what, second or third one, thing like that. It's just interesting, right? Maybe the energy supplier lawsuits will come down the road. You can see we're not going to...
Well, you know, in my past life, I think I was the third co-author of AB 32. And when it was just a climate registry bill before it even morphed into what it was done. And I think it was so revolutionary in terms of what it did, and it required such a delicate balance of regulatory and then the backup systems that it's actually been fairly amazing that it's not been challenged in some fundamental ways as it's moved ahead as it was. And I think that there are always issues. One of our challenges in the administration, you know, somebody that sort of came out of the environmental movement and has had a lifelong record there, is to sort of engage with my colleagues and my friends so that they're not just in an oppositional role and they're figuring out how to actually win and how to participate in a way that's very successful. And there are always challenges with environmental justice, and there have been challenges with forests on the implementation and other issues. But I think there's still places where there probably needs to be some fine-tuning. But if you look at the fundamental change that was embodied and how it's been implemented, it's been remarkable how it's moved ahead in the way it was envisioned.
And validated overwhelmingly at the ballot box.
Well, that's the point I was going to make. In November of 2010, I mean, we actually had an election, statewide referendum on this very issue, and the voters by a percentage, 62% to 38%, said no to a variety of interests out of state, the Koch brothers, the Texas, Valero, Tesoro, and so forth. It was an overwhelming support for the commitment of California in this area, which is in the environmental and energy area, which has been going on, I think, going back to Brown 1, very frankly, and perhaps even earlier. And the policy thrust has been a pretty direct one. It's ebbed and flowed a bit, depending on who sits in the corner office. But the important thing is that the people of California, by a large percentage, and it's regardless almost of political party, although there's some greater support, I would say, on the Democratic side. But the thing is that voters said no to a wholesale retreat, and that was the most significant thing. And that does tend to dampen many people that otherwise would want to litigate and so forth.
But there's a challenge within that, as Mike outlined it. And when Meg Whitman was running for governor, and she was running in the primary, and she proposed a suspension of AB 32, I thought, geez, it is polling overwhelmingly with Republican support. Why is she doing this? And when I read the crosstabs, and this is, I think, a PPIC poll somewhere around the spring of 2010, there was a question in that poll which was varying degrees of how people felt about climate change. And one of the questions was, do you believe that climate change will never happen? And in the crosstabs for Democrats, 4% said yes. In the crosstabs for Republicans, 40% said yes, climate change will never happen. And so while she was making the mistake that in my private life I hope that Mitt Romney's making right now, she was cleaving so far to one side to deal with the primary that she was totally out of sync with the mainstream. But it reminds all of us that while we're having these talks and these debates about cap and trade and implementation, that you always have to regenerate the public debate, that there's a phenomenal number of people that reject science, and that when you have the Academy of Sciences of every major country in the world in agreement on climate change, it's something we have to remind people all the time in a clear way and not take for granted. Let's go argue about the offsets. Well, that might well be an appropriate argument. Nevertheless, we never lose sight about having to regenerate the argument on the overall question.
And California has certainly done that, though some other states have also reconsidered their support and pulled back from the Western Climate Initiative. So, Matt Rodriquez, let's talk a little bit about that beacon. It's a little lonely out there on the point sometimes, leading with other states have pulled back. Can you tell us where WCI is right now? And Reggie, for example, there's some states thinking about pulling out of the Northeast Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Is WCI still holding strong with the few that it has left?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Oh, there are political ebbs and flows whenever you're doing a program like this, and I think that, frankly, a lot of people are watching, as I said initially, what we do here in California. And I think that it is a case where we're just going to have to lead by example. Now, we're in communication with the Reggie states, and actually, they just recently received an economic analysis that showed that cap and trade had been good for the economies in those states. So, it can be positive. We believe it's going to be positive here. We're working very closely with Quebec and making WCI Inc. A viable corporation that can help do the auctions for our cap and trade program. And as I said, I think people are going to watch us and keep an eye on what we're doing.
Do you think other states, if California makes a go of it, those states that kind of pulled back might kind of...
Nobody said, no, we're never going to do this. And it's more a question of, well, let's see what happens, I think. And that's fine. We'll show them what's going to happen.
I always love to tell a story that when I was mayor of Santa Cruz, a notorious beach town. And the police chief decided at one point, without consulting any of us, for the first time in 25 years, to enforce the no alcohol ban on Domain City beaches. And there was a riot for 2 or 3 days. And all my colleagues were nuts over it and were scurrying and hiding. And then all of a sudden, every empirical data point validated the decision. There were less emergency room entrances on the weekend. There were less accidents in the beach traffic going over to San Jose. Families started to return to the beach. And suddenly, all my colleagues were acting like they had thought of this policy change. And so I think what is going on here, what our goal is to be successful and hope that the people that haven't fully pulled away at some point believe that they thought of it and re-engage.
So carbon is equated with drinking. Okay, all right.
Well, no, that's his business.
Very seriously, though, for this audience here, it's to build on something John said. You look at the subtabs and the poll numbers, and it's terrible to allow this issue of climate change and greenhouse gases to fall into this black or red blue kind of debate. And there's been a lot of polling data that further substantiates what John says, that more educated Republicans are those that have turned against this more than others. And that's a very dangerous thing for the society. So it's not enough for us to just congratulate ourselves about California doing this and that and all these things. We also have to proselytize a bit in other states and other places about the seriousness of all this and why it should not be seen as a sharp political issue like evolution was 50, 60, 70 years ago. And believe me, we're moving the wrong direction in aspects of this. And when a man like Romney, who was a leader in creating a program in the New England states, now goes the opposite way, that's very, very dangerous, because I personally believe Obama will be reelected, but he's not going to win by 65 to 35 or something like this. And you have a huge number of people who feel that this is all a hoax. It will definitely impede our abilities elsewhere. So we have to try to talk about this to the best of our abilities in a not ideological way, and to point out the economic benefits, the social benefits, the environmental benefits, all the things of dealing with climate in a sophisticated, intelligent way that enhances our economic well-being, not detracts from it.
Yeah, I'll just say that we continue to be in communication with the other states. They're not going ahead with cap and trade right now, but there are a variety of reasons for that. But we continue to be in communications with them. And as I said at the outset, one of the things that's impressed me is the interest that is expressed daily in our program by the rest of the world. I referred to a call from the Chinese delegation, but that was not entirely facetious. I mean, a delegation from China came by to discuss our cap and trade program, and to be quite candid, they knew some aspects of the program better than I did at the time. The Australian delegation has come by to talk to us. They're going to have a similar kind of program in Australia. There are a number of people watching us. So we'll continue to work with the states. It's become a politicized issue here in the United States, but certainly internationally, a lot of people are looking at what California is doing, and it's not at all lonely at that level. Having said that, our focus is on making this program work in California and making sure that it's a good thing for California. And so a lot of our focus is going into making sure that we can deal with the offsets issues. I mean, there are all sorts of offsets theories out there, but we're trying to be very careful to make sure that we've got offsets policies and protocols that will really work. And we're testing those out to make sure that they'll really work. So there's a little bit more pressure because we're going alone, but in the United States. But we're not alone because the rest of the world is literally watching what we're doing.
And many large corporations, when they make capital investments, are factoring in a price on carbon somewhere. So they think it's going to happen somehow. Karen,
I just wanted to add that you have to speak to people from where they are, and so the same message isn't always the way to have it resonate with your listener. And I think one of the things that was very helpful last year was the governor's climate change conference, which was very specific to extreme weather events. That provided a frame for a certain segment of society to be able to talk about climate change without this big, lofty environmental thing. It was very much a business issue. And I noticed that Commissioner Jones is doing a mandatory survey of insurance companies to talk about identifying climate change risks and how that may be changing their investments. And I think New York is the only other state that's doing the same thing. But I know that just in agriculture last year, there were crop insurance payments on 55 million acres because of extreme weather events across the country. There was an extreme drought and fires in Texas, but there was too much water in the southeast. I know that on my farm in western Nebraska, we had 100% hail out of all crops in a 30-minute hailstorm that came with 50-mile-an-hour winds. There are just a number of those types of extreme weather events that resonate with some people because it's here and now and it's what they're dealing with on a daily basis.
So that raises the question about adaptation. Is California a leader in adaptation? Governor Schwarzenegger required all the states to do an adaptation plan. Extreme weather is not something far away. It's here and now. John Laird.
Well, resources somehow gets the assignment for adaptation, and Matt does emissions. And let's just take one piece of it, because the extreme events conference was in part targeted to that. And Matt and I sit on the Ocean Protection Council, which I chair, and we have an Ocean Science Trust, a bank of scientists, and they did a complete study of the impact of sea level rise on California. And it was very interesting because we adopted it at a meeting that began at 9 o'clock one morning last year, and at 8 o'clock that same morning, the tsunami hit the California coast from Japan, just as we were doing it. And it made a key point that I'm fond of saying is the scientists said by 2015 in California, the median is a 14-inch sea level rise. If you look back 100 years, it's 7 inches. If you go to 2100, the median is 55 inches. But it's not like water just rising in a bathtub. It's the extreme event. It's like I say, it's the 2-year-old cannonballing into the bathtub that really drives home what the level is. And, being from Santa Cruz, and that's one of the 2 harbors that took the big hit in California, it was at low tide before sea level rise. And so, it gets to the same question politically. When I was in the legislature, I was sort of baffled by the fact that nobody was doing legislation related to sea level rise. So I did this bill that was going to require any coastal or Bay Area local government to incorporate sea level rise in their general planning process to be able to plan. And I got hoisted on this dilemma when it got to the Senate. Half the stakeholders said, unless you give us a specific threshold to plan from, we won't support it. And the other half said, if you give us a specific threshold, we won't support it. And then magically, we get the science, and the science resolved that issue. So there's now a scientific basis for dealing with it. And it is still, Al Gore did a wonderful thing for emissions. He got everybody across the country to understand it in a way that they would take personal action. Well, we haven't had that level of epiphany on adaptation yet. so that while we have the science out there, individuals haven't quite understood how it relates to them. And in the agency, we're talking with Fish and Game about certain species having to change elevations and move habitats and what happens. We're dealing with fish restoration in our water projects. We're dealing with the change in forests and firefighting and the sea level rise. And so I think that it's one of those places where we're way ahead in how we talk about it and the studies we've done, but we're probably in the same place as everybody else in the country where the public hasn't woken up to the issue yet in a way that they're taking any kind of action or really understanding clearly how it impacts them over time.
Well, I think, just two quick points. I think that a community like Newport Beach is planning for sea level rise, but they don't want to attribute it to climate change. So, I mean, it's kind of sad in a way, but there you are. But they are planning for it. And I remember one of these conferences 4 or 5 years ago when one of the speakers was from one of the big reinsurance companies, Swiss Re, and they were saying, well, we take this very seriously and we insure, and if you're a Florida property owner, your rates are going to go way, 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 way up. And I mean, that's business talking. I just wish there was more of that, you know, to convince people about the need for adaptation. But Californians are changing behavior patterns. I mean, look at the movement toward electric vehicles and all are as an example of that. So.
I think some of the other parts of the country that have more winters, I think they notice things more. Parts of the country that have more seasons. People back east, like there was like no snow parts of this winter back east, or Snowtober came earlier, or Hurricane Irene, right? They have kind of perhaps some more dramatic things, but
it's a mistake to attribute every variation in weather on an annual basis to climate change, and I think you can get caught up in that in an unfortunate.
But scientists would say they're getting closer to fingerprinting, and we've loaded the dice. The probability of those events has increased, and they're happening more frequently. Karen Ross, water may be the area where Californians feel the pinch first and most directly from declining snowpack, et cetera. Is that sinking in?
Water has been the issue for agriculture since I moved to the state 25 years ago. That was the first drought that I was a part of. And it significantly impacted the use of water, and agriculture responded to all the signals that were given at that time to be more efficient with water use, to plant higher value crops. That's why pistachios weren't even on the radar screen 25 years ago, and now it's one of the top 10 crops in the state, over $1 billion farm gate value last year. People are very conscientious about water and how it's used and when it's used, and it's also unleashing new innovation and new technologies, and I think there's tremendous opportunities on that side of the input business for agriculture to figure out the sensor technology, using GIS, broadband availability so that you can do real-time monitoring in the field. We have soil sampling and water testing and petiole sampling, which is taking the tissue of the plant to know exactly how much water to use and exactly when to use it. And we now have the technology through how much drip and micro sprinkler irrigation technology is out there to precisely apply that water and no more. That also helps us on the energy side of things, reduce our energy use, and also it will help us significantly as we improve our nutrient management practices and the application of nitrogen, which also reduces greenhouse gases.
You were really appropriate, despite water being in my portfolio, to go to Karen first, because in California, 80% of water consumption is in agriculture, 20% is in urban uses. And if you look at what some of the early science has been on the Sierra snowpack, because roughly 25 million of the 38 million Californians get their water out of the snow through the delta in that kind of way. And 90 years from now, it's projected to be 50% of what it is now. And while it's still not understood if that means there are certain extreme events in rain that requires that you capture it in different ways or deal with it, we are in a major changing climate with regard to water in California, And if we have 38 million people now and 50 million in a generation, and the snowpack declining by half over time, we have major challenges. And the question is because there's this fine balance. Even in what Karen said, if you, on the agriculture side, are more efficient with drip irrigation, and you know, in my former legislative district, I was stunned where they used to dry farm apples. They now have dwarf apple trees with satellite-driven, you know, weather reports back and forth that trigger the drip and do the whole thing. But they're overdrafted in that because there's not a lot of recharge coming from exactly that. In the places where you're really efficient, you're taking away the historical recharge, and that might be a challenge. And what it does for California is that if we have all these pressures, and one of our responses is to conserve more and recycle more, it means that what is left to be served has to be at a higher level of reliability. When you take the margin out of your water by conserving and compressing it to what the nut is that people really need, you do not have the ability to conserve 30 or 40% in a crisis without a major business or residential interruption. So it puts more, you know, need for reliability. And there was this huge fight in Los Angeles the day before yesterday over water rates because the public doesn't yet get that paying for reliability is something that is of value. They think, oh, you're just asking to raise my rates on the same amount of water. Well, if it plunges 30 or 40%, and that's what you're paying to hedge against, then that reliability is an important thing to look at in what you do. So we have all those challenges going forward. And to be honest, we're not 100% sure how they hit, when they hit. In certain places of the state, if you build more dams, to the extent there is any place that you can, we're taking them down. In some places in the state, they silt up. Underground storage, it moves up in priority. So it is, I always refer to it as the Rubik's Cube of public policy because there's so many moving pieces, and you address one and another pops out that climate change really accentuates all these underlying issues that were going on in California water policy already.
I want to get to that pricing issue, but first say that water is an area, Karen, Ross, would you agree, groundwater management, California has not been a leader like it has in some of the other areas.
Wasn't that one of your bills?
Oh, you took water, yes. So.
Yeah.
Really,
it wasn't very successful
yeah,
either.
but recent legislation and the funding that came with it through some bond acts for regional water management plans is a huge step in the right direction because it's really recognizing, you know, I talked about 400 crops. That's the blessing and the burden for us because that diversity, different soils, different water needs, managing that, you can't, from a state level, say, here is the prescription for how you shall manage groundwater. It really has to be geographic to the groundwater basin, and it has to be an integrated approach with surface and groundwater and recycling. And there's tremendous progress that has been made with the integrated regional water management plans. There's another acronym for Joel. I don't know how we could do that one. So we are making important progress in monitoring the level of groundwater, but there's two things that John mentioned. One is that underground storage is where there's huge opportunity yet to be gained. And the other is that groundwater recharge should be widely recognized as a public benefit, and that could also help. But we have to be very smart, and we have to be very regional in how we go about doing this so that we can take in the geography and the crop diversity and the people's needs and maximize the opportunity with each one of those resources that are available.
You know, I mentioned the Los Angeles Basin a little while ago, and about 3 or 4 years ago, they had the perfect storm in water where they had something like 27% of normal rainfall in the basin. The Colorado River was in something like the 8th year of drought, and there's significant water from there. And a judge turned off the pumps at the Delta for a while. And if it hadn't been that they'd had this shift about 20 years ago to finally understand that underground storage is significant and had 1.5 million acre-feet in underground storage when that trifecta of crises hit them, they couldn't have made it through. So it's a very significant thing.
And let's pick up on something, John Laird, you mentioned pricing, and people don't understand the pricing of water. It seems that everywhere we turn these days, there's dynamic pricing. If you want to go to a baseball game, there's dynamic pricing. If you want to park your car in San Francisco now, the rates are going to vary. It's coming to electricity. Should we have dynamic pricing for water?
Well, it's one of those things that, as a former city official, I would say yes. We did a thing in the 80s because in our water district, and it was one of those classic things, it's gravity flow, but there's the hills all along. And that's where the wealthier people lived, and the most expensive thing in the budget was energy to pump everything up to the tanks. So we were sort of politically resentful that the middle-income people in the flats were subsidizing the wealthier people in water, and if you have dynamic pricing, it will affect use. So we did an elevation surcharge to appropriately assess the energy costs to the people that were actually generating them. And
so water costs more up on the hills than it does in the,
Yeah, this is, miraculously, it was also ability to pay. But it actually affected use. And over time, we adopted an ascending block rate structure so that the lowest rate was for your lifeline use of water, and every ascending block of it, the price went up. The thing that's a problem, particularly in agriculture, is that, which is 80% of the water, is there are these water rights and allocation systems, some of which began in 1850 when California was a state, so that if you convince somebody in ag to conserve, they're equally concerned about whether they're giving up the water right for the amount they conserved, or that it's going to get reallocated to somebody else, so that actually they didn't really save it. All they did is, in being efficient, got it reallocated to somebody else. And so what we have to do is, over time, deal with those underlying laws in some way that works to actually give incentives for conservation. And because there's historic pricing on different pieces of it, this is a thermonuclear issue, speaking of energy, in the ag world. And yet, if you look at who pays more for water in the ag world, they're the ones that are more efficient. And so it sort of proves the point, and yet there's all these underlying things that wouldn't lead you to an easy way.
Okay, Karen Ross, quickly on water, then we'll get to dynamic pricing and electricity.
Sure. Well, my farmers in Southern California pay the highest prices for water, and they are extremely conservative. We also have a lot of them that are no longer farming, or they've stumped their avocado trees. So there's a certain point where the water is just too expensive to justify continuing to grow the food. It's an extremely important issue right now for a couple of reasons. One is that there's this intense interest in reinvigorating local regional food systems. And in Southern California, being able to source food directly to school lunch programs could re-architecture California agriculture south of the Tehachapi's and find a way to create the value for that food product to go there. We also, at the point, and Joel mentioned this several times, we have 7 billion people on Earth now, rapidly going to 9 billion in less than 40 years. We add 220,000 new mouths to our population every day. They need food, and not everybody can grow the food they need where it is. So being a part of solving this food insecurity issue on a global basis is also a moral obligation for California agriculture to do its part. So this is the time. We need to think this through, because it's not just for us. It is literally a global issue. We're not the only ones dealing with it. I think there's lots to be learned from Israel and Australia and places that really have harvested every raindrop possible, and that we have the innovation here to really attack it. But at some point, we have to understand we may give up the food that comes from the use of that water, and what does that mean on a global basis as well as for us as Californians.
For the food prices, right. Mike Peevey, dynamic pricing in electricity, is that coming soon?
It's coming. It's the next couple of years, next few years. You can't have first, the principle it's based on is simple, that it costs more to generate electricity depending on the time of day. And at 4 p.m. it costs maybe double what it costs at 4 a.m. because there's a lot more usage. You use older plants and so forth. I think most people understand that. You cannot have a dynamic pricing or a time-of-use pricing scheme, however, without having smart meters. And the smart meters are largely being installed and almost done. John's old community is not one of the big boosters of smart meters for reasons that totally evade me, but that's another matter.
I'll invite you over to see the guy that's put the lock and chain around his smart meter, around his regular meter, so nobody can take it out.
And has tinfoil and wears a tinfoil hat. But
It's true.
No, it is true. But the reality is that PG&E's put in 5 million smart meters, and there's about 10,000 people that have chosen not to have those meters installed. So, and Edison is put in close to 5 million. We're not complete yet. By the end of this year, early next year, it'll be done. San Diego, Edison, PG&E. SMUD has done this, 500,000 smart meters now. But you have to have a smart meter to go to the time of use or dynamic pricing schemes or program, and that would be the next step. And that we will evolve to. There's no question about it.
And are smart meters delivering on their promise so far?
They're not all in, so they're not delivering on their promise because you have to have a ubiquitous system, frankly, and then go to a pricing scheme. But I'll give you one example of where smart meters already have showed value that no one would have thought about. And that was we had this terrible windstorms in the San Gabriel Valley at the beginning, end of November, early December. And thousands upon thousands of people were without power in Pasadena and Glendale, Burbank, and in the Edison area in San Gabriel, okay? Many people were out a week. Many average 3-4 days. Many people out for a week. People lost all what they had in their freezers and so forth. In past situations like that, it was a very litigious matter for the property owner to say, I lost $600 worth of meat and so forth, and then how do you prove it? How long were you out? The utility doesn't know until you had smart meters how long people were out when they're out of power. Now they do. So that is off the table as an issue with Edison. Edison knows right away that they were out for 4 days, and they could work out a compensation scheme based on that, and you take one whole issue off the table. So these are just we're getting at the beginnings of the awareness of all the advantages we will have when we have this tremendous information flow that we never had in the past.
Another thing that's happening in electricity is community choice aggregation, another terrible acronym. But Marin Clean Energy is providing what they claim clean renewable energy to the county, providing consumers choice, competition. Is that a good thing? Do you think we'll see more of that in the electricity marketplace?
I think we'll see more of it. There's ironies abound in this. The supplier of the energy to the community choice entity in Marin County is Coral Energy, which is a subsidiary of Royal Dutch Shell. So if you go from PG&E to Royal Dutch Shell, I'm not sure that you really slayed the dragon, so to speak here. But be that what it may, yes, Sonoma County's expressed an interest in doing this. The city that we're sitting in at the moment has expressed an interest in doing this. They've expressed an interest in doing this for many years. They can never quite seem to get to the next step, but that's a problem for the San Francisco electorate. So we'll have to see where this goes. But I think there will be more of this. Now, you have to understand that the utility remains a distribution transmission company and even the billing entity. Right. So you're getting some wind power from Oregon via Coral that, you know, you could toss a coin as to whether you've really significantly changed the complexion here of the energy mix. But
it's lower carbon energy, right? It might be out-of-state energy, but it's lower carbon.
That's right, and then we have other challenges in policy in terms of where it comes from and whether it connects to the ISO and all that, which is probably more than we need to get into here today. But your point is, yes, you will see more of this. What is happening is I think you're seeing the disaggregation of the classic monopoly utility due to a variety of things. We've instituted by statute, again, modified direct access where customers like a Safeway. Safeway buys all its power from Calpine, It doesn't buy power from PG&E or Edison. And we're seeing direct access is back except for residential customers. You have community choice aggregation. You have Muni Light projects where in several communities in Southern California have created municipal utilities to serve the new load in their community, not the existing load, but the growth load. All these things, you have net energy metering, which we haven't talked about at all, and we have distributed generation generally, of which solar on the rooftops is one example, and then the best example. All these things are eroding the traditional monopoly utility base in the state of California. That's a trend that I think will continue with some starts and stops, but it will continue for a significant period of time.
We're going to invite your participation. There's a microphone right here. If you'd like to come up to the microphone, we invite your questions, comments. And while that's happening, I have one more question for President Peevey and one for Secretary Rodriquez. So please come on and join us and join the...
Before we just do all that, I did want to say one thing that I thought was, that we haven't mentioned here, that I thought is very progressive. The governor put out an executive order a week and a half ago, almost 2 weeks ago now, on electric vehicles and moving to a much more dramatic and bolder step in terms of creating an environment for EVs. And part of the reason, obviously, is to do with greenhouse gases. There's many other reasons also to be supporting electric vehicles. And we at the Public Utilities Commission, I think, have come to an unprecedented, which the governor's endorsed, an unprecedented agreement with NRG, where they will spend over $100 million on charging stations and stubs across the state of California in an effort to jumpstart an industry. And I think it will significantly alter the landscape in this state over the next several years.
Secretary Rodriguez, we haven't talked about the low-carbon fuel standard. When you mentioned the auto regulations recently, so automakers over a period of 13 years have agreed to increase their efficiency by 100% for a capital-intensive, heavily regulated product. Oil companies are fighting a 10% improvement in carbon or efficiency, and so I'm just interested in that juxtaposition about autos do 100%, oil companies are fighting 10%. Let's talk about the low-carbon fuel standard.
Well, I don't know what more there is to really say other than yes, we've got a low-carbon fuel standard that I think is very modest and asks for a reduction in carbon by 10%. It's in court right now. But again, it's one of those things that we think we've got very good arguments for why the program is legal and should be moving ahead. And I'm hoping that we can have a continued dialogue with the gasoline and fuel producers so we can see what's really behind this opposition to what I think is a very modest reduction that's required by the low-carbon fuel standard. And we have had some of that dialogue, and I'm hoping that that can continue.
Isn't it really the independent refiners who don't have, that's their main business, thin margins, and the integrated companies, they have a little more leeway to meet something like that?
As I was explaining to some oil company executives I had dinner with the other day, I went to law school to become an attorney. I didn't realize I was going to have to become an economist. But what I did say at the time was, look, I understand your arguments, but as an attorney, I've heard a number of arguments through the years. And what I really need to see is the evidence that supports those arguments. So what I've introduced the oil companies to do is come by, and if they feel, and the refiners feel, that there are economics that we need to be aware of as we're establishing our programs, by all means, I'm willing to have that dialogue, and we can sit down and discuss that. And I'm open to that discussion and look forward to it. So.
Let's have our audience question. Yes, sir.
Good morning. My name is Louis Bloomberg. I'm with the Nature Conservancy here in San Francisco. Thank you for a great panel. Thank you for your unanimous and enthusiastic endorsement of AB 32 implementation. That's very heartening to see and hear. And also thank you for your interest in dealing with responding to the impacts of climate change. Yesterday here, Bill Riley suggested that one way to deal with the communication issue was to talk about climate response or climate adaptation. And so my question to you is and we're pleased Governor Brown kicked this off in December with a great event, and I would like to ask you to look to the future for a year or two from now, and in this theme of California as a beacon, where might the state be in developing a response, a coordinated response to climate adaptation? And in particular, a side question is we're concerned about the potential loss of the climate change research program that was a beacon for California, and it's been threatened by the failure of the legislature to renew the public goods charge. So that would be a piece of what we see going forward, and I wonder if you could sort of project on the future. Thank you.
Let me just comment briefly on the latter point, the public goods charge. We're keeping that going. That's all there is to it. The PUC and the Energy Commission will do that. Okay.
I will say that partially in response to the governor's conference, we do have a climate action team at Cal EPA that has been primarily focused in the past on greenhouse gas emissions and how we can cut back on emissions and that sort of thing. But we have been working collaboratively with the Natural Resources Agency to incorporate adaptation into the work that we're doing through the climate action teams so that we can make sure that there's a coordinated response to adaptation issues as they're coming up. And so that's we're working on making sure that we have a coordinated state response to the various issues that arise in adaptation. And let me just say one additional thing, and that is that I recently spoke with some economists who were out to help us to think about how we can make sure that we can enforce the cap and trade program. And one of the things that struck me was one of the economists was from North Carolina, and he said, this was a meeting in Santa Barbara, and he said, well, I haven't been here before, but being here now for the first time, I understand why California is concerned about climate change. I wouldn't want my climate to change either. And so I really want to put on dealing with climate change. But, you know, we're going to be ready for adaptation to the extent that we need to do that as well. And I look forward to working with the Natural Resources Agency in responding to those challenges.
And the same as well, and there was a state adaptation, I don't know if it was formally called a report or a policy, that was done in 2009. And I think that a significant amount of that has either been achieved of what the goals were in that, and that's why this process is the next generation and something we really have to move it along with.
Governor Schwarzenegger was early on adaptation when it was a dirty word. So I think we have a next question, please.
Hi, my name's Genevieve Lee from Australia, from Carbon Training International. Thank you so much for this wonderful conference. It's been really eye-opening for me to see how California is moving ahead. An issue close to my heart, and thank you for bringing that up, Greg, is the fracking. We are also beginning fracking in Australia, and I'm just wondering whether, in your opinion, a pre- and post-water testing, is that something part of the regulatory framework that you're considering?
Pre and post water testing. We talked about what's in the composition, but also testing the water before so it can prove that a well did it or a drill did it.
Well, you see, there's a regulatory scheme now for everything, whether fracking might even conceivably be a part of it or not. And one thing this administration is doing, picking up on the end of the previous administration, is enhancing the environmental review that is part of that going forward. And there are part of the problems that we have that relate directly to your question is that we have wells that were capped in California that might have been capped 40 or 50 or 60 years ago, and yet because there are new opportunities under steam injection, or if it moved to that fracking, although steam injection is the overwhelming majority of it, it's all in the areas where the previous wells were capped. And just because a previous well was capped, according to the law at the time, doesn't mean if somebody's proposing something now that we do a complete area of review that involves what the water resources might be in the area to make sure that there is no overlap. And I have learned more about this than I ever would have thought. And I was, in the 80s, a coastal leader against offshore oil drilling, and found myself in my first weeks and months meeting with every major oil company at a regular basis. And one of the things that tickled me the most is that I was in a meeting of something like 12 major oil companies, and I said to them, you know, I used to always think you were monolithic and really marched in lockstep. And when I'm alone with you individually, you trash all the other oil companies. You just don't know how refreshing that is. And so, but we are actually working in a partnership with them to move to this level of review over time in a way that we make sure those issues are taken into account.
And I'll say that we have looked at the water quality issues related to fracking and discussed that with the State Water Resources Control Board. There is I think there are plans to look at how do you monitor groundwater in the area where fracking is going on, and if you accumulate information, who's best to take a look at it. So we're approaching that right now and trying to figure out how we want to deal with that issue. But everybody's aware of the fact that that's one of the more significant issues we're going to have to deal with.
Well, we had Erin Brockovich come to Australia, and I thought, if Erin's here, we're in trouble. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Until we have another audience question, let's talk about efficiency. That's an area where California likes to, it's a very good story to tell, as we mentioned, in water as well as electricity. The Rosenfeld curve is often heralded at conferences like this. And yet, recently, President Peevey, Massachusetts was ranked as the #1 in energy efficiency over California by the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. Stephen Nadell, the executive director, noted that in 2009, Massachusetts invested $61 per customer in efficiency, California $32, and that came to fruition in 2012 with California achieving a 1% reduction in demand and Massachusetts 2.5%. So other states are kind of catching up with us on the efficiency story.
Sounds like an individual mandate.
Yeah. Well, I would just say this. Number one, I applaud Massachusetts for doing more. You know? This is probably apparently not the legacy of George Romney, but of the current governor. But the efforts. But they're doing more. I myself and others have doubts about how those numbers are compiled, to be very frank, and the fact that if you're a national entity that you just mentioned that did this rating, you have an interest in boosting more than one state over time, just as in the politics of it. But the more the merrier. I mean, we are spending over $1 billion a year on energy efficiency by California utilities, and that's separate from the precedent-setting efforts of the Energy Commission, not just on compliance standards, but even on regulating large-screen television sets and all that. So I don't think California is anything but #1 in this, and will continue to be. And I want to see a further expansion of these programs and getting the incentives right for these programs.
So California's done refrigerators, flat-screen TVs recently, appliances, not very sexy, but again have a huge impact. What's next on the efficiency front?
Well, there's also batteries. Yeah, they've just done batteries.
Batteries?
There you are. Okay.
The Vampire, the charging devices?
All that. You know, you got the power's on even when you think it's off.
Mm-hmm. Right. So Vampires.
All that kind of thing. But I think that even more significant is that you have to see energy efficiency in a broader context. I mean, even electric vehicles are part of an effort on energy efficiency. They don't simply fall into the little categories that some of these measuring entities use, but it's the whole commitment, the building standards that we have net zero energy and net homes by 2020 and 2030, commercial and so forth. All these things are efforts that California is very aggressive about.
Let's have our next audience. Hi, Annie.
Good morning, Annie Nodoff with NRDC, and it's been very exciting with the administration on moving California forward on climate and clean energy. There's a couple of things that are in the works, though, that I thought I'd ask your opinion and see what's going on with that. One is the Title 24 the energy efficiency standards that are currently being considered at the Energy Commission, and I understand that there's some concern about that. I wonder if anybody has any comments on Title 24. The other is, what is the administration doing to move forward the Desert Renewable DRECP, the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan? That was a really ambitious program that is going to help California make sure we get it right when we do solar energy, large-scale solar energy in the desert. And it seems like that has kind of slowed down a little bit, and I wondered if you had some comments about that. So the building efficiency standards over at Title 24 at the Energy Commission and the DRECP.
Let me take this second question first and maybe even comment a little bit on the first. But the administration is committed to the Desert Renewable Plan, and for those of you that might not know what that is or be intimately familiar with it, basically major location for siting of renewable projects in California is in the desert, and it raises all these issues. If you do not have a global plan, these projects are considered one-off by the individual counties or other places, and if you have to mitigate for them and you look at it regionally, you can put together the entire mitigation scheme in a way that you have the places you know you can locate it, the places you know that you have the ability to mitigate it, you have the buy-in from local governments. And normally, if you were to do a plan like this, it would take 15 years. And there's a goal to do this in 4. So if you ever think we're behind on the 4-year schedule, we're 11 years ahead on the schedule of what it normally takes to do this. And the administration is committed to it, but there are always bumps in the road. There are bumps in the road to make sure that the locals feel bought in enough that there's incentive for them to want to participate in a more regional thing. And there are different interests like that with all the major players. And it is not unlike other processes we have going on where there's just somebody at a given time that feels like it's their time in the barrel. And so you have to work with them to make sure that their issues are addressed and you keep the whole thing on track. So while it may appear there's bumps, and there are, we're just committed and we're trying to work it out and trying to just keep it on track. On Title 24, it's a very similar thing. It's a regulatory process through the Energy Commission, and there are just many different issues and many different stakeholders, and there's just a question of how we can work it out over time. And I think it's a question of when we do it or how we do it, not if we do it. And so, you know, but all those things are at play in different ways.
And is that one of the biggest things left undone in California after doing all the appliances things we mentioned, that buildings is like the next big efficiency thing to go after?
Well, absolutely.
Okay. Mike Peevey, you want to close on that? Anything on Title?
Well, I wanted to close on something else. I was troubled by the conversation about a war on coal that was mentioned, and by the previous speaker, you know, in Kentucky, West Virginia, and all. The reality is that this nation, 50% of electricity is generated by coal, and while that number will come down due to the price of natural gas and a lot of other reasons, we have to learn how to use coal in a more satisfactory way, which means carbon capture and sequestration. And we have an opportunity to, again, lead by way of example in this state with this, with the HECA project in Kern County. And there are other things we can do. We have to be realistic that natural gas is a wonderful fuel, but it's a bridging fuel at best. It has characteristics similar to coal, in terms you'll never get to your 2050 goals relying heavily on natural gas, so we have to learn how to master some of these technologies that are around in a way that greatly reduces their environmental impact, because India, China, and many other places in the world are going to continue to use coal. I mean, we have Australia, which buys into some of the things we say for their domestic market, but is the world's greatest coal exporter. These things you know, they just don't compute and they don't fit, and we have to find ways. And this is where I'm hopeful that California can be a technology leader between our universities, our national labs, and all in pushing the envelope significantly in a much more aggressive, even more aggressive than it has, ways using technology to improve our lot as we could get to a more sustainable society.
And we have to end it there. Thanks to our panelists for discussing California as a beacon.
Thank you, Greg, for a great job, and really thanks to our California All-Stars for really the intellectual heft to do this big lift of saving California's environment, AB 32, and the planet.